Good morning everyone, and welcome to day 6 of our trip to the Torres Straits. Today we're heading back to the mainland, where we'll land at the Northern Peninsula Airport and we'll be picked up by a tour company who'll take us to see the sights of the tip. We'll get to see the actual tip of Cape York, which is the most northerly part of mainland Australia. There's also a few other worthwhile things to see here, including, for those of us with an aviation interest, several crash sites from the World War II era. Like Horn Island, a lot of the aviation history of the Northern Peninsula Airport is steeped in World War II. Even though it's a relatively short flight over open water, our plan is to follow the island chain so that we don't spend much time out of gliding distance to land if we happen to need it. The Northern Peninsula Airport was originally built as a dispersal airfield for aircraft from Horn Island. Horn Island was under frequent attack from Japanese bombers, and as a result they needed to park the aircraft further afield to prevent their damage on the ground. The airfield here has had 6 names during its existence. Originally, it had a contingent of both Americans and Australians based here, and the Americans called it Red Island Point Field, and the Australians called it Jackie Jackie Field. It was called Jackie Jackie Field after an Indigenous guide named Jackie Jackie, who was with Ludwig Leichhardt's exploring expedition that came through the area in the 1800s. Leichhardt and his party were attacked by local Indigenous peoples, and Jackie Jackie was the only one who escaped alive. He made his way alone and overland north to the settlement of Somerset at the tip of the Cape, and his name is commemorated in the names of a lot of local natural features in the area. In 1943, it was renamed by the Americans in honour of an Australian Flight Lieutenant Higgins, who was killed in a Catalina crash. I'm not quite sure why Flight Lieutenant Higgins had his name given to the airfield, because he was killed in New South Wales in a Catalina crash, and I've been unable to find out what his links were, if there were any at all, to Jackie Jackie Field. It's possible he flew out of Jackie Jackie Field at some point. However, I've got no evidence to support that, and I don't think Catalinas flew out of that field. They were pretty much all based at seaports. After the war, it was then named Bamaga Ingenuity Airport, and then that was changed to Bamaga Airport, and more recently the name's been formally changed to the Northern Peninsula Airport. We were picked up by the tour company at the airport and we made our way towards Bamaga. The road between the airport and Bamaga is bitumen, and it's not too bad, but from Bamaga heading north to the tip, it rapidly becomes just a dirt track. It's not a good road by any means, and it includes a creek crossing, and it looks like it would be impossible to cross in anything other than good dry weather. At the end of the dirt track, there's a parking area. Nothing at all there, no facilities, just a few signs, and then you get out and by foot head on up to the tip. There's 2 tracks that go from the car park to the tip itself. One goes out onto the beach through some mangroves and up onto the headland, and the other one goes straight through the headland. So we went out onto the beach and then came back on the headland track. The tip itself is somewhat nondescript. It's a fairly small little point just jutting out from an otherwise fairly wide headland. And if you didn't have a map and a compass or a sign there, you probably wouldn't even realise that it was actually more north of anywhere else there. The only thing that's there is a sign which basically says that it's the most northerly part of mainland Australia, and otherwise there's nothing else. We had a little bit of a look around, walked around for a while and took some photos, and then we headed back to the car park. At the top of the peak there's a stone cairn, and then just behind that there's a brass plaque on a plinth that's got a compass etched into it. Just a few hundred metres down the road from the car park, if you know where to go and take a turn through one of the small bush tracks, you come to the remains of the Pajinka Wilderness Resort. This resort was originally built by Bush Pilots Airways, which was one of the old North Queensland Airways, and it got sold through the 1980s and 90s to various companies. It ended up in the hands of the local Aboriginal corporation. It went into decline through the 1990s, and I remember going there on a road trip in 1997, at which time the only thing operating was a daytime kiosk selling ice creams and snacks and drinks and stuff. At some point, there had been a fire in the main building and the rest of the resort had been closed down, and the whole enterprise was eventually abandoned to the bush. From Pajinka, we loaded back up into the trucks, and then we headed back down the road toward Bamaga, and then after a few kilometres made a turn to the east and went across to the old settlement of Somerset. Somerset was originally formed as a government outpost to act as an administrative centre for the Torres Straits. All access to Somerset was from the sea, and there were no roads to the south at all. It only lasted about 13 years when the administrative centre was moved to Thursday Island. The settlement was predominantly run by the Jardine family. The father, John Jardine, was the appointed magistrate, and his two sons, Frank and Alec, became famous for driving a herd of cattle all the way from Rockhampton to Somerset over 10 months so that they could form a cattle station nearby. When the military contingent of Marines was moved to Thursday Island, the settlement fell into decay, and all that can be seen here now are the remains of the homestead, a small orchard, and the Jardine family graves. There's not much more to see at Somerset, so we loaded into the four-wheel drives and we headed back towards Bamaga. But no visit to the Cape would be complete without a stop at the famous croc tent. To be honest, all it is a tent with trinkets and souvenirs, but it's been around for a long time, and it's one of those famous places where you can't go there without stopping in, getting photographed while you're there and checking it out. We headed back into Bamaga for lunch, and we just went to the Bamaga pub. The company we were with, Explore Cape York, had given us the option of going to Punson Bay for a beach barbecue, but because we'd expressed an interest in seeing the crash sites, they said that we'd be pushed for time, and so rather than going to Punson Bay, we went to the pub instead. The food there was fine. It was typical pub grub, but it was good value for money, and it was fine to go in and have a look around Bamaga as well. The crash sites are all very close to the airport. Both the crashes that we're looking at happened during World War II. The first is a Douglas DC-3 aircraft that crashed in 1945. Even though that type of aircraft in military use was designated as a C-47 Dakota, this particular aircraft was a civilian registered and configured aircraft that had been seconded by the military. So during its use and after its crash, it still retains its civilian registration of Victor Hotel Charlie X-Ray Delta and the DC-3 designation. It crashed early on approach in the early hours of a morning, and there were 7 people on board who didn't survive. The second crash site was a little bit more confusing because the signposts claimed that there were 2 different aircraft in the area. The first was signposted as a Beaufort bomber and the second as a P-40 Warhawk. The aircraft in the Beaufort area was obviously a Beaufort. It was quite recognisable, but eagle-eyed Huey was a bit sceptical of the P-40 claim on the second signpost right from the start. He pointed out features of the P-40 labelled aircraft that made it obvious that it was another Beaufort. While there may have been a P-40 aircraft that had crashed in the area, there were no parts that we could find that were of a P-40. According to the tour guide, the aircraft had been cannibalised for parts after the crashes, and it looked like airframes had probably been moved around in that process. And it's even possible that other airframes like the P-40 had been moved away to somewhere else, and that the second Beaufort had been brought into the area. With a bit of research that night, Huey worked out what model Beaufort it was and what year it was made, and that it was probably made in Australia. I've since looked at the parts again in the photos and compared them to original aircraft on the internet, and the tail section is definitely a Beaufort, not a P-40. So anyway, it was still an interesting thing to look at, and the P-40 airframe was never found, but the Beauforts were quite obvious. Didn't take us very long and we got back to the airport. We thanked our hosts for their hospitality, and we loaded up our aircraft and fired up, ready to head back to Horn Island.